Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Titania Harris, and it is my pleasure to present the USF IRB lecture series. Now, these presentations are being made available to provide faculty and students with education on common USF IRB and BULLS IRB topics. We have 3 lecture presentations, and this is lecture IRB 102. IRB 102 covers the protocol and consent overview, human subjects education summary, and IRB resources. Let's get started. Let's go ahead and start with protocol overview. Now, there's some things to consider when you are thinking about your protocol template. First of all, I want you to consider this. USF IRB requires that USF affiliated investigators use one of the USF protocol templates when creating your protocol. If you are an investigator at one of our affiliated organizations and also affiliated with USF, you are required to use the USF protocol templates. Now, if you are an investigator at one of our affiliated organizations and not affiliated with USF, you are not required to use the templates, but the templates are still available for you to use, and why not? Now, let's talk about the 5 different types of protocol templates we have. We've got biomedical, social behavioral, record review, and 2 site supplement protocol templates. Let's start with the biomedical template. Now, you will use this biomedical template for biomedical research, and this includes investigational or biological devices, drugs, experimental procedures. You will use the social behavioral research protocol template if you are doing behavioral observations, focus groups, interviews. You will use a record review protocol template when you're doing a retrospective chart review or medical data analysis. Now let's talk about the site supplement protocol template. As I mentioned, there are 2 of these. There's one for industry-sponsored biomedical research and another for industry-sponsored social behavioral research. So what I want you to do is look at the sponsor protocol and our template, and if at any section within our template, if we are requesting information that's already in the sponsor protocol, instead of typing the information within our template, you're just going to give us the page number that corresponds with that information. We don't want you typing the information twice. So, for example, if we're asking for inclusion and exclusion criteria and it's already within the sponsor's protocol, just give us the page number in the USF template section for the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, if at any point while you're reviewing our template, if we are asking you for something that's not within the protocol or within any of the sponsors' study documents, that's where you're going to type out the information in this section. That way you don't have to do it twice. We don't want you reinventing the wheel. Now, where can you find the protocol templates? You can find them in the BULLS IRB library section. You're simply going to log into BULLS IRB, click on library, and then templates. And there you will find all of the templates that we have. We also have samples that help you with drafting your protocol. If you need a finished product, some of us, we need to know what it should look like in order to give it to you. We have samples for those types of learners. Now let's go over some things to consider when drafting the protocol, and also I want to review some common mistakes that PIs make when they're drafting their protocol. So first things first, let's talk about the very first page. So on the first page, you will find instructions. Please review those instructions as you complete your protocol template.
Remove the italics font from the final protocol. Italics are instructions on how to complete sections, and that font should be removed from the final protocol. Do not delete sections or charts. If a section is not applicable or a chart not applicable, you can simply put NA by the section, but don't delete the chart. Do not change the version number or date. Version numbers and dates should be changed on final protocols when you do revisions. Because your protocol is still going through the IRB review process, it is not finalized, and therefore you will not change that version number or date. The same goes for the information in the revision history chart. That information is when you make changes to a final protocol. And as I stated, your protocol is still going through the review process. It is not finalized, so therefore you will not put any information in that chart. Next, let's skip over to section 1.0, the study summary chart. Now, if sections are not applicable to your study, simply add N and A. You do not have to type out, we do not have a, just N and A. That's very fine. Now, let's point to that study population arrow, where this is your inclusion and exclusion criteria with the age range. So you need to add an age range when you identify your study population. The next one that I want you to take a listen to is the study duration for individual subjects. So study duration for individual subjects is the time frame that one subject is expected to be in your study. For example, if Titania is going to be in your study, how long is it going to take me to do an interview or take me to do a survey questionnaire? We want to know one participant.
Now let's go to section 3.0, background. This section is where you will add relevant background information about your study. Now remember, you are the expert. You need to bring us up to speed. And this section allows you to add information so that the board and IRB can understand how you develop your research. Now, if you have citations in the background section, please add in the reference section 24.0 in biomedical and 23.0 in social behavioral. Add it to those sections. Don't add your references here, add it there. Now, remember, you should not add sections or charts in the final protocol. Remember that.
Okay, let's jump to section 6.0, data and specimen storage for future research. A lot of PIs get a little lost in the sauce when we do this, so let me take your hand and walk you through each one of these steps. For social behavioral, this is going to be section 6.0. For biomedical, it's going to be section 7.0. So the first bullet is asking if you will store your current study data specimens for future research use. Now, if you will not utilize your current study data specimens in future research, you're going to place NA at that section. If you will utilize your current study data specimens for future research, you're going to describe in section 0.1, you're going to describe where the data specimens will be stored, how long it will be stored, how the data specimens will be labeled, and how it will be accessed, and who will have access to that data specimens. Now 6.2 for social behavioral and 7.2 for biomedical is a follow-up to that first bullet point. If you will not utilize your current study data specimens in the future, you're going to place NA here also. Now, if you will utilize your current study data specimens for future research use, you're going to list in this section the data to be stored or associated with each specimen in this section. That's where you're going to put it, in this section. Now that last bullet is a follow-up to that first section. Again, if you will not utilize your current study data specimens in the future, you're going to place NA here. Now, if you will utilize your current study data specimens for future research use, you're going to describe the procedures to release that data specimens in the future. You're going to include in this section the process to request a release, approvals required for release, and who can obtain the data specimens, and the data provided with the specimens. Now let's jump to section 9.1 for social behavioral and 10 for biomedical. Now this is your inclusion and exclusion criteria. We're going to go through each one of these. Now there's a little difference with biomedical. Biomedical point 1 is asking for you to describe how you're going to screen for eligibility. For example, we're going to use medical record review. The next bullet, which will be 9.1 for social behavioral and 10.2 for biomedical. The next bullet is asking for you to describe the criteria that defines your study population with the age range. Remember that age range. How are they eligible to participate in your study? So let's use an example. Let's say you're doing college or nursing students ages 18 to 35 years old that are taking Statistics 101. Bam, done. Now let's do the next one. 9.2 for social behavioral and 10.3 for biomedical. Now this next bullet is asking for exclusion criteria. Excuse me. Please note, exclusion criteria refer to criteria that would exclude a person who meets all the inclusion criteria from participating in your study. It's not the opposite of the inclusion criteria. Let's use that same example about college or nursing students. Let's say if the college or nursing students is taking Statistics 101, if they're also taking pharmacology classes, they're excluded from your study. That's how you would do this. Now, you don't have to have an exclusion criteria. If you don't, you're just put NA there. Now, let's jump down to the next one, which would be 9.3 for social behavioral and 10.4 for biomedical. Now, this bullet is asking if you, the PI, have circumstances that would make a subject that's already in your study and eligible to continue in your study. Let's use an example. If your study inclusion criteria are that students must be enrolled in Statistics 101, let's use that college or nursing criteria that we had. 18 to 35 taking Statistics 101. Now, if they drop the statistics class, this would be a criterion that would make them ineligible to continue, and then you would list and explain it in this section. Now, you don't have to have such circumstances. If you don't, you'll simply put NA there. Now, the last bullet in each one of these sections, 9.4 for social behavioral and 10.5 for biomedical, you're going to put, you're going to tell us, let's see, how can I say this? So this section is asking for you to indicate specifically whether you will actively enroll students, not just USF students. Actively enroll employees, not just USF employees. Actively enroll social and or economically disadvantaged individuals, wards of the state. So this PIs get confused in this section because they're thinking, oh, it's just USF students or it's just USF employees. It is not. This is asking for students, period, employees, period. So if you are not actively recruiting students or employees or socially economically disadvantaged individuals or wards of the state, you can put NA here. If you are, we're asked that you give us that information, and it's going to pop up a little later on, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Now, let's talk about the recruitment method section. Now, it's going to be section 12 in social behavioral protocol and 13 in the biomedical protocol. Now, that first bullet is asking for you to describe the recruitment process from start to finish, the when, where, and how you will recruit your subjects. The next bullet is asking you to select the recruitment method in your study. Then you are to describe each method you selected. be sure you have the recruitment documents uploaded to your Bullseye RV application in the local site documents section, which is question 2, recruitment materials. Now, section 12.3 and 13.2 are follow-ups to section 9.4 and 10, your vulnerable populations in social behavioral protocol, and 10.5 is relevant to section 11, vulnerable populations in the biomedical protocol. Now, if you indicated in either one of those sections that you will actively recruit a vulnerable population and or any of the special populations, that would be students, not just USF students, employees, not just USF employees, socially and economically disadvantaged individuals and wards of the state, you need to describe how you will minimize undue influence and coercion during the recruitment of this population. All right, now let's talk about the consent process, which is section 21 in social behavioral and 22 in biomedical. Consenting varies for each study. I want to be sure you understand how to complete the consent section when you have an online, verbal, or in-person consent. Now, you will select the applicable consent, assent, or consent waiver for your study. Keep in mind that all research participants must give assent or consent by signing this consent assent document before they can participate in a research study. For this type of consent, you will select the highlighted options in the chart. Then complete the appropriate sections below the chart. Remember, if the section is not applicable, you will add NA to the section. Now, if you want to waive the signed consent process, you will select the applicable sections in the chart. Keep in mind that the waiver of documentation of consent from the IRB means that the participant does not have to sign with wet ink the consent to give voluntarily consent. Now, when completing the appropriate sections below the chart, remember you are required to justify why the wet signature is not necessary. Right? Investigators could simply state that obtaining wet consent is not plausible because the study is virtual. Also remember that if the section is not appropriate or applicable, you can just simply put NA in the section. Now be sure to use the mentioned checklist within the protocol when completing this section. If you determine based on the checklist that the waiver will not work for your study, but you would like to obtain signed, signatures remotely, you can use the electronic consent or the e-consent. Now, this is a method of obtaining informed consent with an electronic system instead of a paper consent form. Be sure you select the appropriate section in the chart. Now, when an e-consent platform is used, the consent process can occur in person or remotely. However, the electronic platform that is used to obtain the e-consent must be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, especially if your study is if you're receiving any federal funds. Now, this information will be added to the appropriate sections below the chart. Again, if a section is not applicable, you can simply add NA to the section. Okay, so this section, the settings section title, can be misleading. So in social behavioral, it's section 22, and in biomedical, it's section 23. Now, in the settings section, you are not only describing the location where you will conduct your research, but also including information on data extraction analysis and research data storage. Now, in this section, you are to include information on where the data is obtained, such as location, where you conduct study interviews, or obtain the study recordings, or however your study is performed, and where on USF you will analyze and extract the data, and where on USF will data be stored. Now, let's go over it a little bit. Let's dig into it a little bit. Now, if conducting research data analysis and extraction at a non-affiliated site or affiliated site, you will add this location Elaborate on that in this section. Also, be sure if this site is non-affiliated that you upload your letter of support in the Bulls IRB application. Now, this letter lets us know that you have permission to conduct study activities at the site. Now, if you have other sites, please include the study activities for each site. Also, be sure to select the affiliated site in the Bulls IRB application. Now, if you are conducting research data analysis and extraction at a USF college or department, a library or computer lab, or a USF affiliated clinic or organization, you're going to elaborate on that here and add the location. Now remember, the office room number is not necessary in this section. Now, if you are performing a virtual study and are storing data on a cloud storage, you will indicate the USF College Department affiliated with that cloud storage and elaborate on the study process here. Now, I want you to please note that you may not add your resident address in the Bulls IRB application. Here in the protocol, you will include justification for conducting a virtual study activities at your resident and add your resident area in the protocol. For example, PI's North Tampa resident or PI's Brandon home office, however, but not your address. Now, you will have to also indicate where on USF you will conduct virtual study extraction and analysis. Now, this is the USF College or Department affiliated with that USF Cloud Storage account. Now, if you do not want to make I do want to make you aware that it is not permitted to store documents and or identifiable data at a private resident during conducting of your study, nor archiving it after it's completed. It is also not acceptable to store identifiable protected health information at PHI, that's PHI, for research purposes on personal computers or portable devices. Now, the location and all information that is placed in your protocol should be consistent with the Bulls IRB application and study documents. Now remember, the last section in the protocol is where you will add citation information. Remember, in the background section where you add relevant background study information, this is where you will add your citations in this section. So please add links if available or any sources. Just make sure you add that information here. Again, this information supports the IRB and understanding your research better. All right, let's be sure everyone is on the train. Let's test your knowledge. I know everyone just got hives just now. No! It's super simple, I promise. Okay, when creating your protocol, you may delete sections if they are not applicable, true or false. Okay, this is false. You should not remove or add sections to the final protocol. If a section is not applicable, you can simply add in A. All right, true or false? When you are editing your initial submission, do not add information to the revision history chart or change your revision's number date. True or false? All right, this is true. The revision history information and version number date is to be updated when revisions are made to your approved finalized protocol. During an initial submission, your protocol is still being revised, thus you should not add information in the chart or change the version number date. Yes, you guys did awesome. I'm sure you did. And Data agrees. I love Star Trek, so I must put a Star Trek reference in here. Hee hee hee. All right, now let's jump into the consent overview. Okay, so the procedures used in obtaining informed consent should be designed to educate the subject population in terms that they can understand. Therefore, informed consent language and its documentation must be written in lay language, and that means understandable to the people being asked to participate.
Now, informed consent is more than just a signature on a form. It's a process of information exchange that may include, in addition to reading and signing the informed consent document, subject recruitment materials, verbal instructions, question-answer sessions, and measures of subject's understanding. Thus, rather than an endpoint, the consent document should be the basis for a meaningful exchange between the investigator and the subject. All right, let's talk about IRB consent templates. So USF IRB has developed standard language to be used in portions of all consent documents. Standard language is typically developed for those elements that deal with confidentiality, compensation, answers to questions, injury language, HIP authorization, and the volunteer nature of participation. Where changes are needed from the standard paragraphs or format, the investigator can save time by anticipating the IRB's concerns and explaining in the submission to the IRB why the changes are necessary. You just simply have to let us know what you're doing. We can't read your mind.
There are 7 biomedical consent templates, and we're going to go over each one. The first 2 are the adult consent and adult Spanish consent. So the Spanish consent is used if the subject representative understands more than one language, like Spanish. So the consent process should be in their preferred language. For this example, it would be Spanish. Now, you may translate the English consent in any preferred language of the subject population. Just keep in mind that the IRB must have specifically approved the protocol to allow the enrollment of non-English speaking subjects. Once the IRB has reviewed and approved the English version of the informed consent document, the approved document must be translated into the language understandable by potential subjects and submitted as a modification for IRB approval. Now, the translated copy may be submitted with the English consent form with the initial submission as an alternative to submitting a modification. However, changes requested to the English version during the initial submission review must also be reflected in the non-English version. So the translated document must be verified by a translator or translation company and back translated. So the verification must attest that the translation is accurate and complete. Back translated documents should be translated by an individual who speaks the language fluently and back translated by a different non-study team member who speaks the language fluently. I know it's a lot, but we want to make sure that the potential participants understand the informed consent. Okay, so the next one is the biomedical assent. Now, by definition, children are unable to provide informed consent to participate in research, although they might be able to give their assent. Assent is an agreement by an individual not competent to give legally validated informed consent. That would be a child or a cognitively impaired person. And this assent is obtained by talking with the individual and providing them with an assent form that is appropriate to their age and comprehension level. Assent is an ongoing interactive process that respects the individual's autonomy and preference. Thus, if the child does not want to take part in the study, assent process stops. Now, we move on to parental permission or consent. This refers to a parent or guardian's explicit permission for the child to engage in a specific activity. Remember that minors cannot make legally binding decisions in certain cases, such as participating in a research study. Obtaining formal authorization from parents or guardians is essential before their children participate in research activities. Next, we have the LAR. Now, an LAR is a legally authorized representative and is sometimes known as a proxy. In accordance with Florida Statute 765.401, healthcare decisions may be made for the patient by certain individuals in order of priority. Keep in mind that an LAR cannot be utilized unless it is an IRB approved process. Now we go to the genetic genomic consent addendum. Now, if your study involves genetic testing, you will add the genetic genomic consent addendum. And finally, if your study will involve unapproved drugs, biologics, or devices for expanded use, compassionate use, or humanitarian use, you will use emergency use or compassionate use consent. Now, to obtain the IRB review and approval, a new study submission must be submitted in BULL's IRB. I want to make you aware that for more information about emergency use or compassionate use, you can review the investigator manual for question 39. Okay, now we have 7 social behavioral consent assent templates. Just like biomedical, we have the adult consent and the adult Spanish consent. Now remember, if the subject representative understands more than one language, like Spanish, the consent process should be in their preferred language of Spanish. Also, you may translate the English consent to any preferred language of the subject population. Just keep in mind that the IRB must have specifically approved the protocol to allow the enrollment of non-English speaking subjects. And the translated copy may be submitted with the English consent form in the initial submission as an alternative to submitting a modification. But remember, when submitting a modification for another language, the changes that are made during the initial review process to the English consent must also be reflected in the non-English version. And we have the assent, just like the biomedical consent. Children are unable to provide informed consent to participate in research, but they may be able to give their assent. As a reminder, assent is an agreement by an individual not competent to give legally valid informed consent to participate in a research. Remember, if the child does not want to take part in the study, the assent process stops. For parental permission, consent, like biomedical, refers to a parent or guardian's explicit permission for a child to engage in a specific activity. It can be given separately or combined with the consent and parental permission. Then we have the LAR, which I went over, a legally authorized representative, and is sometimes known as a proxy. Keep in mind, it can't be used unless you have IRB approval. And then this one is the one that everyone seems to love. This is for your surveys, your interviews, focus groups, and these are usually virtually. Thus, we combine them in one consent document. Now, this document does not have a signature block. We're going to dig into that a little bit later. Where can you find it? You can find these templates in the BULL's IRB library section under the templates tab. Boom, there they are, biomedical consent and social behavioral consent templates. Now, unfortunately, we do not have samples of these consent documents because it would be far too many variations of how individuals would give consent. But the consent documents are super easy to follow, and you can edit the document to your liking. For more information about how to create a consent document, you can review the Investigator Manual, question 20, How do I create a consent document? Now let's talk about some required elements when you are obtaining consent. Okay, so the subject or legally authorized representative, which is an LAR, signs and dates the consent document.
right? That's a no-brainer. We know they have to sign, but let's talk about the LAR. LAR is sometimes known as a proxy. Now, in accordance with Florida statute, healthcare decisions may be made for the patient by certain individuals in order of priority. An LAR cannot be utilized unless it is an IRB approved process. Again, you must have IRB approval for this process before you can use it. Some studies may be eligible for a waiver of documentation of consent, like online survey or remote telephone interviews, and we spoke about this. In these cases, the PI should create a verbal or online consent form without the signature lines, and the participant will instead verbally agree to participate after being read the consent form, or click an I agree or begin survey tab to indicate consent on an online survey component. Again, this waiver of documentation of consent must be requested in the protocol, and you must add for you to get the waiver, you need to add justification for seeking this waiver. Now, it is helpful to refer to the checklist and worksheets to ensure you are providing the appropriate information in your study documents. We're going to dig a little deeper in the checklist and worksheets a little later on. The individual obtaining consent signs and dates the consent document after the subject signs. You cannot pre-sign your consent forms. It has to be after. Basically, you are verifying that they are verifying that they are they, you are verifying that you are you. So you have to sign in front of them. Now, in addition to signing the consent, the subject representative should enter the date of signature on the consent document to permit verification that consent was actually obtained before the subject began participating in the study. Now, if consent is obtained the same day that the subject's involvement in the study begins, the subject's medical records or case report form should document that consent was obtained prior to participating in the research. A signed copy of the consent document must be provided to the subject, and the original signed consent document should be retained in the study records. Whenever the IRB or sponsor requires a witness to the oral presentation, the witness signs and dates the consent document. Now, this witness may be a family member or a friend, but it cannot be a person involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of the research study. This process should be outlined in the protocol and IRB approved in advance. Again, you must have IRB approval of this process before you can use it. If the subject representative cannot read, obtain an impartial witness to be present during the entire consent discussion to attest that the information in the consent form and any other information provided was accurately explained to and apparently understood by the subject representative and the consent was freely given. So they can't just witness the signature, they have to witness the entire process. Now, the witness can be a family member or a friend, but the witness cannot be a person involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of the research study. Now, let's get into the common consent documentation errors.
So the next two slides are going to talk about informed consent errors that are pretty common, right? And some of these you may know, some of these you may not. First is the use of an unstamped version of the consent document. Now, I'm going to show a picture of what this looks like a little later. But essentially, it means that you're required to use the version finalized by the IRB, which has the watermark and date stamp. Now here you go. If your study was determined to be exempt, you will not have a watermark stamp, and you're going to be informed of this in your approval letters. Read those approval letters. To ensure you are using the correct consent, be sure to use the consent forms from your BULLS IRB application in the Documents tab. Next is failing to reconsent. Now, if your consent has been updated and the IRB has determined that there are significant changes, it will tell you to reconsent your active population, right? Your active participants. Now, that means you would need to have all of them sign again on the new form. This is normally for ongoing research where you see subjects several times. It's not just a single session type of study. Now, in case you have to reconsent, be sure you read your IRB approval letters to know how to proceed after a modification, because it's going to state in that modification that you have to reconsent if you have to do that. Next bullet is regarding lost or discarded original signed documents. Now, if somebody signs the consent and then later you say, oh no, wait a minute, we shouldn't have had them sign the consent because they don't look like they meet the criteria. You shouldn't get rid of that signed consent document. Do not shred it. Don't discard it, even if you scan it. That's not acceptable practice at this point at USF. Now, if you lose it, it could potentially be a big deal. Just think about it for 1 second. You have a person's signature on a form that could potentially tell others something personal about them, and now it's out there in the ether for others to see. Now, if this happens, there's a potential for what we consider a breach of confidentiality. Now, that requires reporting to the IRB promptly and your privacy officer. Next bullet is about the lack of source documentation about the consent process. Now, this would be an extra form or location that documents how the consenting process occurred. The more complex the study is, the more important this document will be. Now, if there's discrepancy somewhere on the signed consent, you can always go back to this document to help bridge the gap of missing information. The next one is signing with a non-permanent writing instrument, such as a pencil or a highlighter. I used to teach, and I would have a student, her favorite color was purple, and she would do all of her quizzes in this purple glitter pen. Every time I think of this, I think of her signing a consent with this purple glitter pen. Okay, all study records should be signed with a permanent writing utensil such as a pen, preferably blue or black ink. Now, this is so alterations can be readily visible. Okay, all right, next is when individuals don't print their own name or date their own signatures. Now, unfortunately, it is a requirement that they are to do this themselves. Now, if you have a study population that has a high risk of pain while writing, such as hand injuries or severe rheumatoid arthritis, you can put in your protocol that you're going to print the name, print and date it, and they're going to sign it themselves, or however. You could also do a virtual consent, just put it in the protocol that you're going to print and date the signature for them and include the reason, as long as you have justification of why you want to vary from the signed consent process. The IRB will generally approve that in those situations. All right, so the last bullet is about having somebody sign for the subject, even though the subject is capable of signing for themselves. Now, an example of this would be if you are in a hospital setting and the subject isn't feeling well. The spouse or adult child may very well want to jump in and sign for the patient, but they're not supposed to do this in research. Now, for medical care, that's different, but for research, that is essential that the participant signs for themselves when they are able to do so. Now, if your study allows for a legally authorized representative, or LAR, in Florida we call it a proxy, I told you guys that, you could have a family member sign it as is outlined in the Florida statute. You can find the details of this in the investigator manual located in Bull's IRB. All that means is that the participant is not capable of deciding whether they want to participate because of mental incapacity or they're unconscious, and the closest kin can sign for them. But keep in mind that the use of an LAR cannot be utilized unless it's an IRB approved process. So you can't be in the thick of things and then decide, oh, we'll just get the LAR. It has to be approved before you can use it. Okay? Okay, let's continue with informed consent errors. So this first bullet is the wrong version of the informed consent used. Now, if you have a protocol that changes and with it a revised consent is submitted to the IRB, it's important to stop using the old one. Always go to Bull's IRB and print from the Documents tab for your latest, most approved consent. Don't use outdated language. Using the old version affects the patient and subject's rights. Next, when you have two IRB approved consent forms for two populations, but you use the wrong one. Now, I know it's like, that's pretty odd, but no, it happens quite frequently. Now, this happens because the subject listens to what you are saying and they quickly scan over the document before they sign it. They don't even realize the document isn't meant for them. An example of this is if you are enrolling a study where you have a coach who's supervising 10 students, adult students. There is a coach consent and then there is an adult student consent. Now, if you hand them a document and then verbally explain the study, but they don't read it, they may end up signing the wrong one. Now, I would highly recommend that you go page by page explaining what is in the consent document before they read it on their own. Now, you'll never have them sign the wrong one if you're going through the document with them. Take time and step away from them. Give them some time to focus on the document and read it for themselves. All right, last bullets right here, we're going to be talking about incomplete or inaccuracies on the consent document itself. Now, this is when there is missing or wrong dates, missing or incomplete signatures, such as the first initial last name. Another scenario is sometimes when we get excited after the participant signs and then we don't sign it ourselves. This actually happens quite a bit too. You have to remember that the consent process is more important than any other thing that you do in protecting their rights. So make sure that you are finishing the job by signing and dating it and then double checking to make sure that everything is correct before you move on. Now, another one that is very common is when the subject signs on the wrong line or they put in the wrong date, and they often result in their scribbling it out. Now, they don't generally correct it properly, and I'll show you an example of this in a little bit. They just kind of scribble, scribble, scribble. Make sure you show them how, draw a line, initial and date, and put the correct information. A missing witness is more for blind or illiterate, for example. It's only when it's applicable. This means that you read the consent form to them. If they're blind or illiterate, you read the consent form to them, and then you point to an area to where they will sign on the document. In this scenario, you will need an impartial witness. Now, the witness is there. The witness is there through the whole process, not just them signing it. The witness may be a family member or a friend, but the witness may not be a person involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of the research study. And this process should be outlined in the protocol and IRB approved before you can use it. All right, and then this last one is backdating. Backdating is something that should never, ever, ever, ever be done. Researchers have high integrity, and you're on the honor system, right? Because we all understand that this research that we are conducting is very small in comparison to the global or national effect that it's going to have. We don't want to taint the pool with doing something that's not going to be right, because what if my mom, what if your mom, what if my family member, what if me, what if we take a medicine that everyone tries to cut corners on? So researchers have high integrity, and you're on the honor system, so no backdating. This isn't something that you should ever do.
All right, let's be sure everyone's on the train. Let's test your knowledge. Now, before we get into the pop quiz, here's a screenshot of what the first page of a consent document generally looks like. Let's go over each one of these. So the red circles show you where the IRB approval stamp is at the top and the watermark at the bottom. Now, you're supposed to use a version with the stamp and the watermark. Although remember, exempt studies will not have a stamp watermark. Use the consent that is found in Bull's IRB under the Documents tab. That's the best practice. Let's go to tip number 1. I got a few tips for you. Tip number 1. We want to distinguish between the old PRO numbers for study approvals before October 2020, and the study numbers found in the new Bulls IRB system. So PRO 111 is not the same study as Study 111. So make sure that you are adding the correct IRB number to your documents. So that second tip, if you're enrolling two populations, like in that example that I gave you about the student and the coach, consider adding something on page 1 so it's highly visible which population this form is intended. Now let's go to tip number 3. When you are changing your consent content, remember adding a version number or date in the footer. This is another way to help make sure that you are using the most currently approved document. All right, now as for the test. What's wrong here? I think it's pretty obvious, but let's give a few seconds. All right, this is something I mentioned before about scribbling and not correcting properly. On a consent form, the scribbles are more important than any other place in the sense that we want to make sure that the participant truly signed before they started any study procedures. An incorrect date may lead us to wonder if the subject truly signed before the study procedures were started. The most transparent way to correct errors is with a single line through it, the corrected information written next to it, and then initials of the person making the correction with the current date. Now, that black box over in the bottom shows you how to properly correct errors. That's it. You guys did great. I know you did great. I know you did great. And the peanuts think you did great too. Now, here are a few more tips or reminders. Subjects are required to get a signed copy of that consent document. Now, in order for that subject to have a copy of a fully executed consent form, the consenter must sign in real time after the subject signs. Now, if you don't have access to a copier, you could just bring 2 copies of the consent and both of you guys sign both of them. Now, next, with the extra time, maybe 2 seconds or 20 seconds or whatever, just take some extra time to double check your consent. Make sure all pages are signed. If there should be initialed, make sure they're all present. Make sure all spots, dates, signature, make sure everything is accurate. Just take a couple of seconds. I say 20 seconds. It could take you shorter than that, but whatever, to make sure everything is there. In the past, before I printed the informed consent, I would go through each page and point to their initials, printed name, signature date, and my printed name, signature date, and then I would make a copy of it, give it back to them, and do the same thing. Okay, here's your copy where your name, your initials, your date. So just take a few seconds. If you take those few seconds, you can make sure that you're doing something correctly, right? All right, now let's dig into HSP or city training. All right, investigators and staff conducting research involving human subjects research must complete human subjects protection, which is HSP education. Now, this requirement applies to all human subjects research regardless of funding or source of sponsorship. Members of the research team who have not completed HSP or city training may not be engaged in human subjects research. Also, the IRB has the authority to suspend or withhold approval of projects that involve investigators and research personnel who fail to meet this education requirement. Now, this requirement extends to anyone engaged in the research, including individuals who collect data about human subjects, those conducting study procedures or interventions, and those who have access to private, identifiable information. Please review the Investigator Manual Question 4 for additional support. There are many different ways to Grandma's house. One way to obtain this necessary training is to attend the student workshop that is offered every fall. Now, this offers PI and study team members an opportunity to obtain HSP, and it's valid for 3 years. Now, for information about registering for this event, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to the newsletter. Another way to Grandma's house is to register and complete the city courses. Now, this educational requirement, much like the student workshop, is designed to increase understanding of the regulations, federal and institutional policies, as well as ethical standards that govern the protection of human subjects. Again, all study staff are required to maintain current human subject research education. You can go to CITI and you can find out which course is acceptable for you. We've got 3 different types. We have 2 for biomedical, 2 options for biomedical. They can do the biomedical investigator and key personnel, or they can do the GCP one. We only have one option for social behavioral, and that's the social behavior investigator and key personnel. Now, once you take that initial CITI course, after your 3 years, you just have to take a refresher course. You do not have to take the whole thing again. So that's the best part, and it's valid for 3 years. Now, before you submit your application to BULLS IRB, you're going to want to make sure that your study team members have updated Human Subject Protection Certification in CITI. Now, if your HSP or CITI is not populated in the ARC account, all you got to do is email the IRB help desk with your certificate and also the certificate of your staff. Now, allow 2 to 3 days for the system to populate with your certification. Now, for additional information on CITI, please visit the BULLS IRB website and go to the guidance document section, and bam, boom, you download the CITI flyer. It has a step-by-step process on how to register for your CITI. Now let's go over some IRB resources. All right, so I want you guys to be aware that all of the resources that we have for you guys is to help make the research world a lot less intimidating. Just a little bit less intimidating. So you're going to want to go to the BULLS IRB homepage. You simply type in irb.research.usf.edu. Then you're going to go over to the left-hand side and click on the Regulation and Guidance tab. Then it's going to bring you to this folder, Regulation and Guidance folder. We're going to go through each one of these folders. So in the General Regulatory Links folder is where you can find regulatory guidance, like if you want information on the Belmont Report. In the Guidance folder is where you're going to find all of USF IRB educational flyers and videos. All of it is there. Now, in the IRB Education and Spotlight Presentation folder is where you can find information on how to request a personal presentation and also information on the Spotlight presentation. So the Spotlight Presentations is a new initiative that was created to support our researchers. We're going to have one faculty and one student present their research. This is an opportunity to support our USF students in getting acclimated with presenting their research, and an opportunity to faculty to get some added recognition. The next folder is the IRB newsletter. This is where you're going to find all previous newsletters. Now, the USF IRB newsletters often have relevant IRB training information like that workshop I told you about, also tips and information for BULLS IRB submission and general research information. Please sign up for the newsletter so you can receive this information. You can send an email to the IRB office at rsch-irb@usf.edu. Now, the Revised Common Rule folder in the Single IRB Review folder offers information on the Common Rule as well as Single IRB. Now let's go over the checklist. You can find references to applicable checklists throughout the protocol. Now these checklists are cheat sheets. I call them cheat sheets because they can help you in drafting your protocol and creating your consent. Now the purpose of these checklists is for the IRB staff when we are conducting review of your study documents. It is not required by you and should not be uploaded to your BULLS IRB application. Like I said, it's a cheat sheet. Just think back when you were in middle school and you had your little cheat sheet. You didn't turn it in with your quiz. You kind of tuck it underneath your desk so nobody could see it, right? That's what we want you to do with this sheet, with the checklist. They're cheat sheets. Don't turn them in. Keep them to yourself. And I know I'm not the only person that had a cheat sheet in middle school. Again, worksheets. You can find references to applicable worksheets throughout the protocol, and these worksheets are cheat sheets again that can help you in drafting your protocol and creating your consent. Again, the purpose of these worksheets is to provide support to the IRB members. We are reviewing your research. It is not required by you and should not be uploaded to your BULLS IRB application, but it tells us what to look for when we are checking your work, so you'll know what to put in your work, so therefore you can get through it. That's why we call it a cheat sheet. It's super amazing. It's a cheat sheet that you can use. I don't know if that's considered a cheat sheet, but whatever. Another amazing resource is the Investigator Manual. Now, the Investigator Manual is designed to guide principal investigators and study team members through both USF policies and procedures and federal regulations related to the conduct of human subjects research, and it's written in a question and answer format, so it's super duper easy to follow. I love this document. Make sure you get we updated it recently, so make sure you're downloading the most recent copy. Where can you find this? Go to the library section in BULLS IRB. You're going to click the General tab, and bam, boom, you're going to click on the Investigator Manual. Now, this document is going to download as a Word document. I'm going to ask that you save it as a PDF because you'll make changes to it, like your girl here. When we were in the office, I made changes to the document by mistake, had to delete it, download it again, and I saved it as PDF. So now my error becomes your help. All right. Now let's go over some common questions that I'm often asked as we go through my presentations. These are questions that people usually ask me. The first question is, are master protocols allowed by USF IRB? Why or why not? So it depends on the PI. If you are an investigator at one of our affiliated organizations and also affiliated with USF, you're required to use that USF protocol template. Now, if you're an investigator at one of our affiliated organizations and not affiliated with USF, you're not required to use the template. But like I said, the template's free and it's there for you to use, so why not? Why not? All right, next question I'm often asked is, how do I obtain training or assistance if my questions are not answered via the Investigator Manual? And I told you guys the Investigator Manual is an awesome document, but I mean, sometimes people get lost in the sauce. And if that happens, we have tons of educational resources for you on our website. So if you go to our website and you go to the guidance document section, you're going to find all these wonderful flyers that cover city registration, NHSR, initial BULLS IRB submission, and so much more. Now, there are many different ways to Grandma's house, and we also have educational videos. We've got videos too. Not everybody learns the same. And these videos cover some of the same material and some of it is not. Like there's a video for USF IRB resources. There's videos on what happens next after the BULLS IRB submission. And you can also find these videos on our YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel as well. Now, we are going to be adding to that YouTube channel in the coming months. So if you're not already subscribed to the monthly newsletter, I'm going to ask that you get subscribing. Now, you can simply send an email to the IRB help desk and they'll be able to show you how to get subscribing to the newsletter. And I'm going to show you that in just a little bit. Just a little bit. All right, the last question that I'm often asked is, does USF offer pre-review support prior to IRB submissions? Like if you're a new PI and you just want, you want additional support. Well, unfortunately, the IRB does not offer pre-review before submitting to the IRB, but the IRB is here to help. If after going through all those videos and the Investigator Manual and you're still lost in the sauce, it's okay, it happens. Just send a specific question to the IRB at the general IRB newsletter. I'm sorry, send a specific question to the IRB general inbox. So here we go. Got the information right here for you. if you have specific questions about Bulls IRB or ARC, if you need support with ARC or need support with Bulls IRB, you're going to send an email to rsch-arc@usf.edu. Now, if you have questions about training and education presentations, you're going to send an email to the IRB general box at rsch-irb@usf.edu. All right? Also, please let us know how we're doing. If there's something that we need to add or change, just let us know. You can send that email to the general box and let us know about that. And also, we like pats on the backs too. So if we're doing something right, let us know that too.
And you did it. You finished lecture series IRB 102. We have additional lecture series on our website for your review. Thank you so much for watching, and go Bulls!